During my birthday, I was lucky enough to scratch off one of the many places on my bucket list that I wanted to visit. Stonehenge has always fascinated me, and I've always heard weird and wacky theories of how and who built it. Thankfully, we are now more aware of the history of this beautiful site, and in this video we will take an in-depth look at both the history of Stonehenge and the people that made it. Enjoy. Although Stonehenge today is a hugely impressive ruin, it would have looked very different when it was first built. The circular ditch and bank, which are the earliest parts of the monument, were formed from the chalk that underlies the site and would have been a gleaming white. Also from this early stage of Stonehenge's construction is a circle of large pits known as Aubrey holes, which lie close to the inner edges of the bank. They originally held up timbers and small stones, and some are now indicated on the ground with metal and stone markers. The most visible elements of Stonehenge are the stones themselves. Some are small, unshaped or broken, others massive, finely worked and intact. The stones of the central cluster, brought to the site about 2500 BC, are arranged in a series of circular and horseshoe-shaped structures. Other stones near the inner edge of the bank and in the entrance of the earthwork enclosure had companions that are now vanished. The arrival of the stones marked a radical change in the appearance of Stonehenge, and the huge sarsens, once in place, remained there. But the smaller blue stones were rearranged in different ways, and some were removed or destroyed. The position of the stones today reflects only the last of these settings, completed by about 2200 BC and restored in the 20th century. Before written history, it is necessary to depend on archaeology to provide evidence for dates of structures. Artifacts such as pottery, tools or metalwork can provide a rough indication of date for structures, and only radiocarbon dating can provide a more precise date. But what is radiocarbon dating? All things contain carbon. When something dies, the radioactivity in this carbon decays gradually over time. Radiocarbon dating measures the amount of radioactive carbon remaining in the archaeological sample. For example, bone, antlers or charcoal. When calibrated against the radiocarbon content of tree rings with a known age, it can give a very precise date. At Stonehenge, not all the individual events can be dated. However, radiocarbon dates were obtained for the antler picks used to dig the ditch and for a few animal bones found at the bottom of the ditch. These showed that the first stage of the monument was constructed between 3000 and 2920 BC, and that some of the animal bones were several hundred years older. Other carbon samples from the site have given dates for the early sarsen stone setting of about 250 BC, and for the final bluestone setting that was about 2200 BC. Surprisingly, excavations carried out in 2008 within the stone circles produced dates ranging from the Mesolithic about 8000 BC. This showed that the site and the area around it were being used long before and long after the main period of construction. From its earliest phase to its abandonment some 1,500 years later, Stonehenge was one of the most important temples in Britain. Since then, it has been viewed by different people both as a mystery and a source of inspiration. From the Middle Ages onwards, people have been trying to understand the origins of Stonehenge and answer the more important questions of how and why it was built. New excavations and reanalysis of previous finds have continually changed the way the site and its landscape are interpreted, and these changes continue. Like many things in history, information is subject to change. What follows may not be the final answer to the story of Stonehenge, it's simply our current understanding backed by the evidence that has been discovered. Previous interpretations of Stonehenge have divided its long and complex history into distinct stages, which perhaps gives the impression that it was built in this way, as a series of very distinct events. There are certainly times in its history when the appearance of Stonehenge did not change dramatically, but in between, there were other slight changes which are harder to date with complete confidence. There are also particular moments in time when we do not know how Stonehenge appeared. We often imagine life at this time to be a struggle for survival in a hostile world, but we now know that this wasn't always the case. There were many places, both inland and on the coast, that provided stable food supplies and all other necessities such as fresh water, stone for tools, or wood to construct fire or shelter. In these areas, which were rich in natural resources, it was possible to settle on a more permanent basis instead of leading the more common nomadic hunter-gatherer life. This was not long after the Ice Age had ended, a time when Britain was still connected to mainland Europe. As the sea levels rose in the warming climate, the vegetation changed, and some parts of the new island of Britain became densely forested, with elm, oak and hazel gradually replacing earlier pine forests. Some areas remained open grassy plains that were very attractive to the pioneering farmers of the early Neolithic period. Stonehenge lies within one of these areas, where farming could start without having to first clear out woodlands. These first farmers created small, garden-like fields, unlike those of today, in which they grew crops such as wheat and barley. Nearby these farms roamed domesticated animals such as cows, pigs and sheep. These people also brought new ideas from mainland Europe. The first simple round-bottom pottery, new types of flint tools, ground axes and fine leaf-shaped arrowheads, and most visible today, the idea of building large-scale structures from earth and stone. Farming, even on a much smaller scale, brings stability. It allows people to come together, to celebrate and to commemorate their dead in ways that demonstrate their connections to the land. These first farmers were the builders of two monumental enclosures, Robin Hood's Ball and Lark Hill, just north of Stonehenge, which shaped the landscape, laying the special foundations for what was to come. The first Stonehenge was an earthwork enclosure, its slightly sloping central area defined by an irregular dug ditch with an interior bank of a more regular profile. There were two certain entrances. One faced northeast and remained in use throughout the active life of Stonehenge, while a smaller one faced south. The position of the main entrance was crucial to the function of Stonehenge. It faced along the line of natural gullies, towards the midsummer sunrise in one direction and aligned with the midsummer sunset in the other. The alignments of the entrance to the enclosure in this direction was deliberate and suggested that Stonehenge, from its earliest phase, was concerned with the movements of the sun. The irregularity of the ditch suggests that it may have merely been a quarry to provide chalk. The bank can be radiocarbon dated using samples from an antler pick found on its floor to about 3000 BC. The construction of the enclosure was clearly a communal effort, and it is possible that individual sections of the ditch were dug by different groups of people. Small bands of individuals, families or tribal groups may have come from some distance to work together on this great project. Inside the enclosure and around the inner edge of the bank were 56 large, regularly spaced pits which were dug at the same time as the ditch. These originally held either wooden posts or small upright stones, but many of them eventually contained deposits of cremated human bone. Many of these deposits have been found during excavations cut into the bank and just inside the inner edge, as well as in the pits. What I'm getting at is that this is evidence that very early in its development, Stonehenge was a cemetery. The next stage in the development of Stonehenge saw the start of its transformation, sometime around 2500 BC. From a simple earthwork enclosure to something quite spectacularly different. Many stones were brought to the site, huge sarcens from Malsborough Downs and perhaps elsewhere, and smaller bluestones from the Preseli Hills in Wales. Immediately outside the enclosure entrance, the heelstone was probably moved and was joined by 2 or 3 entrance stones, one of which still survives as the slaughter stone. Inside the enclosure, 4 small sarcens, now known as the station stones, were set upright just inside the inner edge of the bank. But what radically and permanently changed the appearance of Stonehenge was the arrival, shaping and raising of the horseshoe stones. This seems to have happened in about 2500 BC, but over what length of time this major construction took place is unknown. There is also a lack of archaeological evidence to show in which order the two main structures were built, suggesting that the horseshoe stones were built first, or at least before the outer circle was largely finished. What is more certain is that about 2400 BC, Stonehenge had been transformed. The outer circle was probably completed, but varying care has been taken in the way in which it was constructed. The northeast side, facing out towards the entrance, was extremely elegant. The gently curved intels beautifully shaped and joined, and the upper surface of the stone ring that they formed was almost exactly level. Recent detailed studies of the stones, based on laser survey, have emphasised that the stones on this side of the circle, those that can be seen from the entrance, are much more finely worked and smoothed. In contrast, the southern west side of the circle appears irregular and almost unfinished, with many stones far more roughly shaped. Equally elegant and even more massive were the 5 trilithons. Graduating in size from shortest pair that faced each other across the open end of the horseshoe to the tallest, the Great Trilithon, that stood facing the enclosure entrance. The Sarsens also show some variation in their selection, as each trilithon has one upright that is very well shaped and the other that is rougher. This appears to be deliberate, but to what significance? At this point, we can only guess. The same stones also vary in the degree to which their surfaces have been smoothed and finished. Their inner faces are all flat, while most of the outer surfaces are rough. The only exception here is the Great Trilithon, the back of which is as smooth as its front. The Sarsens were definitely the most visually impressive part of the transformation of Stonehenge, but it seems likely that some of the blue stones, either relocated from the Aubrey Halls or newly arrived from the Preseli Hills, were also set up in the interior at this time. They were not, however, in the location that they stand today. The blue stones were set up in a particular arrangement that is only known from excavation. Within the Stonehenge landscape, there are other henges. Woodhenge and Combray, and at the Durrington walls, not only a great chalk enclosure with massive timber circles, but also evidence of everyday life. This may well have been the village where the Stonehenge construction workers lived at certain times of the year. The completion of this stage in the development of Stonehenge marked an end of a massive undertaking for its builders. Their engineering on a monumental scale had created one of the most iconic prehistoric structures in the world. You might have thought that the great rebuilding in stone that took place about 2500 BC would have marked the end of Stonehenge's active use. Unlike many other monuments that were built at this time, and which marked the end of Stone Age tradition, Stonehenge continued to be modified and presumably remained important for nearly another 1000 years. During these years, Stonehenge's continuing importance was emphasised by the hundreds of burial mounds that sprung up on every surrounding hilltop. At Stonehenge, some structures did not change. Once in place, the massive Sarsens, arranged in their circle and trilithons, were never again moved, but centuries later they were decorated. Shallow carvings were added to many of the upright stones, the majority representing broad axe blades that can be dated on the basis of their shape to between 1750 and 1500 BC. The smaller blue stones were easier to rearrange. By about 2200 BC, their first setting, the incomplete circle in the Q and R holes, had been dismantled. Its components, together with perhaps the blue stones from other dismantled monuments in the area, were then rearranged as a circle and an oval. The oval of finely worked pillars lies inside the Sarsens trilithons. This structure, by the removal of a few stones on its northeastern side, was later turned from an oval into a horseshoe that mirrors the much larger Sarsen horseshoes. This then is the final overall arrangement of the central stone structures, the ruins of which can be seen today. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. There are so many interesting facts that I haven't covered about this fascinating site, so I encourage you to dive deeper. Most of the information in this video was from the English Heritage Stonehenge Guidebook. You can purchase it online or from the site itself. I definitely recommend that you visit the site. The surrounding landscape is so beautiful, and there are more monuments and historic sites in the area that are within walking distance. If you enjoyed and wish to see similar content, then please like and subscribe. It really goes a long way for the channel. Thank you.